It's my pleasure tonight to introduce the subject and speakers for this event, which is sponsored by both the Colloquium and the Institute. So we're here to have a conversation about derangement, more specifically about what our guest of honor, the acclaimed novelist Amitav Ghosh, calls the Great Derangement, climate change, and the Anthropocene. But we are blessed tonight to be led by two friends who might just help us think through this madness, to approach the unthinkable, or who can, at the very least, help us to better know the nature of our crisis. Our respondent is Professor Debjani Ganguly. As many of you know, Professor Ganguly is the director of the Institute for the Humanities and Global Cultures, a professor in the UVA English department, and a distinguished scholar of world literature, post-colonial studies, and South Asian studies. Her most recent monograph, entitled This Thing Called the World, the Contemporary Novel as Global Form, was published by Duke University Press in 2016. Yet many of you may know Professor Ganguly best from the remarkable intellectual community that she has cultivated on ground since she took up her post here, a community which has just this semester included such luminaries as Michael Hart, Sandra Mazadra, Amanda Anderson, Margaret Kelleher, and Anki Mukherjee. Her scholarship and her work with the Institute continues to demonstrate just how invaluable the global humanities are, especially as we face problems that transcend borders of all kinds, problems like climate change. Yesterday, Debjani introduced Amitav Ghosh as one of the most outstanding storytellers writing today, a novelist of epic scale and historical sensibility who, through his prodigious and renowned literary works, has played a key role in reconceptualizing the globe through his attention to the transnational connections made visible in the Indian Ocean world. And while I will not repeat that introduction tonight, I do want to speak briefly about Ghosh's contributions to the environmental humanities, an interdisciplinary field of research which he helped create and continues to shape today. Indeed, Amitav Ghosh has given the environmental humanities a focus for scholarship, objects for study, and now a new theoretical paradigm. In 1992, with a review of Abdul Rahman Munif's novel Cities of Salt, he accidentally launched a new focus of academic research, the study of petrocultures. In 2004, as he became more explicitly interested in environmental problems, Ghosh published The Hungry Tide, considered today a central work in the emerging canon of contemporary global environmental literature. Beyond The Hungry Tide, his sustained literary attention to the entanglement of cultural, economic, and non-human lives offers scholars in the environmental humanities both key objects of studies and models for imaginative interdisciplinary thinking. In more recent years, in journalism, essays, and interviews, he has spoken eloquently and forcefully about climate change, collaborating with leading environmental scientists to tell audiences across the globe inconvenient truths and ask why they are so inconvenient. Tonight, Debjani and Amitav will join us to speak about his latest and most sustained engagement with these issues, his 2016 monograph, The Great Derangement, Climate Change, and the Unthinkable. Please welcome Amitav Ghosh and Debjani Ganguly.
Amitav, thank you again. I had an opportunity to thank you yesterday, but today, this afternoon is I think, a very special event for UVA. We not only have various engagements across grounds with all kinds of issues and concerns about the environment, but increasingly the more urgent issue of global warming and climate change. And your book couldn't have been more timely in so many ways, not just in conversation across grounds, but just to start with, you know what there are so many books on the problem of climate change today from multiple disciplines. To me, it was very significant that a voice heard across the globe on so many fronts as a very serious novelist, you took the plunge to write and name this problem a derangement. To me, it was important. And I'll tell you why, because you know, we often, when we hear of the problem of climate change, we tend to blame the politicians often for not seeing what the problem is. Why can't they see that there's a problem? They are crazy, they are deranged. And you know, what your book did was actually open our eyes to how many dimensions of our lives, not just politics, but including serious literary, artistic engagement, historians, the imaginary of the historian, those concerned with built environment, and of course our rampant consumerism, how complicit we are all in this derangement. It was really the power of the book and in just eloquent prose. So I just want to begin by, inviting you to talk a little about the urgency that you felt as a novelist to write these series of essays that have already had such an impact. So any thoughts?
Certainly, but let me begin by saying thank you for inviting me to be here. It's really such a pleasure to be here in Charlottesville with my in-laws who are from Ivy. So it's really nice to be here. Derangement, yes, it was extraordinary. The other day I went on YouTube, which I do quite a lot because I love listening to lectures when I'm doing useless things. So I turned on the latest lecture by Noam Chomsky, and to my astonishment, he mentioned me and the Great Derangement and used the phrase several times. So the phrase seems to be coming into popular use as such. Well, for me, the book really, I've had people describe it as a call to arms and so on and so forth, which it isn't at all, really. For me, it's a kind of introspection about my own practices, So I was really trying to examine my own practices and the ways in which the form of the novel itself, which is something that I'm deeply wedded to, but, the form of the contemporary novel really sort of, in many ways, prevents you from working towards certain sorts of issues, So I suppose that was really the sort of, that was really the motivation behind it as such.
Okay. Thanks, Amitav. For those of you who have read the book, you would know that Amitav actually addresses these issues through under just 3 single-word titles: stories, histories, and politics. And in the conversation, Amitav, I'll take you through sequentially through those, your very insightful, your reflections on each of these. Since you mentioned that the trigger was really you thinking about what novelists of our time can do or are not doing. I'd like to invite you to share with us your perception of the certain kind of a mainstream novel, where you cite Updike's review of Munif's novel, where you say that what has become dominant in the novel form is an exploration of individual moral responsibility over collective responsibility, over men in aggregate, that Updike said, and also a kind of an estrangement of man from nature, or the non-human divide is too stark in literary works of our times. So I just wanted to invite you to, I guess, share your thoughts about where you see the spectrum of novels from the kind of mainstream novels we talk about and the divide that we have with science fiction, on the other hand, that has often written in the catastrophic form, in dystopic forms about climate catastrophes, and where the problem lies in the way we can begin to imagine a new form of novel that probably bridges this divide.
I don't think there's any problem with the novel as a form as such, because, I certainly believe that the novel, as a form is incredibly broad and incredibly generous. And it's able, like no other form, to deal with a great variety of things. But it's rather the direction that literary fiction has taken over the last 30 or 40 years, Because even if you consider, say, for example, Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, in so many ways, Grapes of Wrath is, a climate novel avant la lettre, If you look at the first chapter of Grapes of Wrath, it's just such a powerful rendition of a climate reality, an extraordinary climate reality. It's really one of the most powerful things ever written in America, I think. Similarly, if you think of, for example, Melville, after all, no one has written, certainly not within the modern period, no one has written more powerfully about non-human presences than Melville did, I mean, everything that I would want, that I think is necessary today to respond to what we are facing is present in Melville, a very powerful sense of the uncanny, a sense of the ways in which the human is intervening in the non-human to create this absolute catastrophe that we are faced with. All of that is completely present in Melville. So, for me, Melville is really the great novelist, But the problem really, I think, starts in, maybe we could even say in the 30s or 40s, when we see the novel as a form taking a certain direction, After all, Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, there's no doubt that Steinbeck is, or rather Steinbeck was the most influential American writer of the 20th century. And strangely, that is not true of America. But wherever I've been in the world, I remember asking the great Burmese novelist Mia Than Tint who were the main influences on his work. And he cited to me two names, Gogol and Steinbeck. I remember asking the great Indonesian novelist Pramodya Anantatua the same question, and he cited exactly the same names, Steinbeck and Gogol. So it's an extraordinary thing. I mean, his influence on the world is really remarkable. But within the American literary establishment, he was hated. He was hated, derided. He faced just incredible hostility. It's quite remarkable. I read recently about André Gide, He had written a laudatory review of Grapes of Wrath, and he got so many poisonous letters from his friends in America that he gave up reviewing books altogether. So what happened at that moment? What happened at that moment that made the Steinbeck approach impossible? And really, we tend to think of the 20th century as a time when aesthetic movements were powered by aesthetic trends.
Yes.
But actually, what really powered the aesthetic movements of the 20th century were intelligence agencies. This is an extraordinary fact. I mean, the first abstract expressionist exhibitions were funded by the CIA. And the CIA really very actively promoted certain forms of art which they conceived of as being alternatives to social realism, which was equally strenuously advocated by the KGB. So what you really have is that moment of Cold War politics, which creates a certain sort of dynamic which actually closes certain doors aesthetically. I don't think it was in the end a sort of, for any aesthetic reason that that door came to be closed. Because if you look at Grapes of Wrath, really, everybody probably thinks of it as a realist novel. Yet, if you do, if you go through the book, you'll see that almost 80% of it is direct speech. Direct speech in a dialect that is alleged to be the dialect of Oklahoma. But how do we know it's the dialect of Oklahoma? It's really, after all, Steinbeck was an upper middle class Californian. So it was his rendition of a certain, so it's a rhetoric, which is, after all, in some sense, its distance from the real is as great or as small as any kind of rhetorical form. So, and I think since 1989, 1990, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, this direction has, this movement has actually accelerated, so that now most fiction, I would say, is really about issues of identity. More and more about issues of identity. If you ask any literate person anywhere in the world, anywhere in America or indeed in India, for novels about nationalism, race, gender, they'll be able to name so many. If you ask them to name novels that are in which climate change figures in any sense at all, I think they'll be completely at a loss. It's very, very hard to think of such books. So here again, what we really see is the strange way in which our history has propelled us in exactly the wrong direction, so to speak.
Thank you, Amitav. I'll, since you mentioned the Cold War, the period of Cold War, and the support of abstract expressionism and abstract forms of literature, especially by the non-communist world, that was also the period, and that's one of the most fascinating aspects of your book in the history section, and probably also the one that's generated some controversy, is the post-50s. Post-50s is also the period of decolonization, and at the same time, the period of the great acceleration that climate scientists tell us, where the parts per carbon. I mean, every kind of impact of global warming, all of those vectors, you see that massive rise in the graph, right? And that also is the period of decolonization during that period, the 50s and the 60s. So you have these multiple histories being layered on top. You have the Cold War, you have decolonization, and then you have accelerated global warming. And that kind of, and kind of a meticulous argument that you have over pages, you conclude by saying that in some senses, since decolonization began quite late, in the 50s, imperialism, in some senses, delayed the onset of global warming. This is a completely counterintuitive reading of imperialism, and some scholars have said, you've been seeing something good about imperialism in relation to global warming. It's not what I'm saying, but it's a terrific and a provocative way of seeing the role of imperialism in relation to global warming. And I'd love to hear a little about, from you about the role of Asia through the 50s and the decolonization period and its relation to imperialism and global warming.
Well, that's a very big question. I don't know where to start, really. But look, let me begin by saying in no way am I suggesting that this is an apologia for imperialism.
Yeah, no.
I mean, I'm just talking about history as it actually happened.
Yeah.
So, if you read the literature on climate change and global warming, one of the most striking aspects of this literature is its unbelievable Eurocentricism.
Yeah.
I would say it's the most Eurocentric discourse that I've come across. And it's really remarkable because actually most discourses today are not that Eurocentric, or people are aware of it or whatever. But if you look at the literature on climate change and global warming, everyone will actually give you dates on which this regime is inaugurated. They'll say either James Watt's steam engine or the spinning Jenny or this and that. And that is where the use of fossil fuels starts. But this is an absurdity, because in China, people have been using fossil fuels for centuries. I mean, they were not only using coal and natural gas, they were actually piping natural gas into their houses. So I mean, they knew perfectly well how to use fossil fuels. They would actually carry natural gas when they were traveling in order to use it to. Now, I've written about Burma. So anyone who knows Burma knows that there's this place called Yenangyaung, which is in central Burma. And it's a place where oil rises naturally to the surface. And for centuries, people have been using that oil. They've been using it for medicinal reasons, as naphtha for putting on your body. I don't know. It seems strange to us to put that kind of oil on your body, but people did. And we have elaborate descriptions of it from the 18th century onwards of very large numbers of ships coming upriver to take away this the oil. And they created a technology actually to pull out this oil. They had these derricks, they had buckets, they had a particular set of people called the twin czars. Now, if you look at any standard history of oil, the first thing it'll tell you is that the whole technology of bringing oil to the surface was invented in Pennsylvania by one colonel's, I forget his name. But, this was happening in Asia for centuries. And certainly, the way, you are perhaps old enough to remember what Shell oil used to be called.
Yes, of course, Burma Shell.
It was called Burma Shell. So one of the reasons why the British had their eyes on Burma, of course, one reason was another kind of fossil fuel, well, not fossil, but carbon fuel, was teak. But the other reason was absolutely, the oil fields of yin and yang. And if you look at the kings of the Konbaung dynasty, who were then the kings of Mandalay, they understood perfectly well what they had. They reached agreements with British candle makers and British users of paraffin. They nationalized the oil fields. They intervened very actively in the oil. I mean, all of this they knew. They did exactly what the Iranians were to do later, what the Saudis did. So all of this had been actually completely anticipated in Burma in the mid-19th century. So how is it that we just shut our eyes, to this entire history and say this history is completely Occidental? It's not. I mean, anyone who looks at the history, at the history of modernity knows now that this is a very hybrid process. Modernity emerges as this incredibly hybrid process, whether it be in science or in literature or in philosophy. We have translations of Leibniz happening in Persian in his own lifetime in India. We have the Kerala School of Mathematics, inventing calculus, and this may well have been transmitted back through Jesuit priests. I'm not making this up. There are histories. There are histories of these subjects. But anyone who looks at this history knows that modernity was not a single thing. It was many modernities. Modernity was this very complex, interlocking kind of sets of processes. One of the greatest historians of our time, Sanjay Subramaniam, has made this argument.
Yes.
Many others have made this argument. Now, if you believe in, if you accept that there were many modernities, then you have to accept also that that this technology could have been replicated elsewhere, especially in the 18th century. The technology of steam. After all, if the steam technology is invented in Britain, how does it spread to, say, Europe? It's through mimesis. Europeans imitate it. Americans imitate it, and then they sometimes, do more with it, and so on. So what is there to say that Indians could not have imitated this technology?
Yeah.
Not only did they imitate it, actually in the late 18th century, India was the world's second biggest market for steam engines. This is shown by the records of steam engine manufacturing companies. Indian entrepreneurs, Rabindranath Tagore's grandfather, Dwarkanath Tagore, the Nawab of Awadh even, they were desperately enthusiastic about this technology. They wanted to create steam engines. The enthusiasm behind creating railways in India didn't come from the British. It came originally from Indians. Tagore's grandfather started the first steam flotilla company in Bengal. So they were buying engines. They were recreating the engines in India. So Indians would have been all too happy to start a fossil fuel economy inside India in the 19th century, just as it was happening in the West. Why did this not happen? Because Britain needed raw materials. So through financial measures, it essentially stifled the fossil fuel economy in the colonies.
Yeah.
And they couldn't stifle it in America because America was independent by then. They couldn't stifle it in Europe because European countries were too powerful. But in the rest of the world, they could stifle it, and they did.
Yeah.
Anybody who looks at this history, this jumps out at them.
Yeah.
So let's say if decolonization had happened after the First World War, let's say 1918, of course we would have seen
a much quicker rise.
An adoption of the fossil fuel economy, around the world much earlier. I think this is just common sense.
Yes. No. Thanks. There's just so much to think about there. Amitav, if one stays with the history and the story sections of your book, another fascinating aspect of your book relates to the question of built environments, and especially building of these mega cities on oceans. I just found that narrative, and especially the history that you trace, that in pre-modern times, there were specific warnings to governments, to civilizations, to the public, that one does not build beyond. This is a danger point. One doesn't come this close to the ocean. But you kind of trace that history, and then so this is another derangement, that some of our biggest cities, mega cities, are actually built and now completely endangered so we have colleagues from architecture here, we have colleagues from, environment and architecture here. So, so if we can have a little more, a conversation about that. I think that's one of my favorite parts of your book, your comparison with Bombay and New York, just the sheer similarities in which they were constructed or imagined into existence close to the ocean, and the lifestyles of the rich and the famous beside the ocean, So, yeah.
Well, human beings didn't appear on this earth loving the ocean. No. That was something that actually emerges, in this post-Enlightenment period. Humans were actually terrified of the ocean. Nobody thought the ocean is beautiful. And actually, I often find it strange that people think that the ocean is beautiful. I mean, I don't know if you've ever spent time in a room, in one of those hotel rooms that look out at the sea. I mean, after an hour or two, it becomes really oppressive. It's a kind of scary, and I mean, at least for me, I don't care for it at all. But human beings were afraid of the sea. I mean, you think of the great pre-Enlightenment cities of Europe. Which were the great ports? People traded, of course, but which were the great ports? London is very far from the sea. Paris, Stockholm, Lisbon, all of these are in estuaries. I could just go on and on, but the same pattern is true of Asia. Surat is one of the great ports of India, is recessed from the sea. Similarly, the great ports of China, Hangzhou, Guangzhou is almost 100 kilometers from the sea. So historically, people were careful to keep their major points of settlement away from the sea, in locations that were not so exposed to, say, tsunamis or cyclones or whatever. Now, my first inkling that something was weird about this came after the 2004 tsunami. Because I went, when the tsunami happened, I was in India, and I got a commission to go to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which are actually very close to the epicenter of the tsunami. The Nicobar Islands end here, and Sumatra is sort of over there. And actually, there's just 100 miles between India and Indonesia there. And the epicenter of the quake was somewhere here at the tip of Sumatra. So really, Aceh, which was devastated, and the Nicobar Islands were equally badly hit. So I managed to get on a plane, an Indian Air Force plane, and I got to Car Nicobar, which is absolutely flat. And in Car Nicobar, there was an Air Force base. And I got off at this base, and I looked around. And there was something so haunting about it. The base was so designed that that the runway and the sort of technical parts were inside, like a couple of 100 meters from the sea. And all the residential areas were right on the beach. Navies and armies and air forces being very hierarchical, the commandant's house was actually closest to the beach. And in sort of declining order of seniority, the houses were arranged. And of course, the plane airmen were sort of inside. So when the tsunami hit, it hit within a few minutes of the earthquake. your possibility of surviving was in inverse order of rank, And so it's such a strange, ironic thing that, but it also struck me that, this was not an accident. This was an act of governmentality. It was an act of governmental reason. Obviously, military planners came there, they saw this, some designers saw it, and they built this in this way. So this was what they thought of as a legitimate way to build. And it was a way that was literally courting catastrophe because, the Nicobarese themselves, the indigenous people of Nicobar, never built on the sea. They all had their settlements inland. So they were completely unhurt. Whereas the major settlement in this town, in this island, was actually directly on the sea again, and it was completely flattened, erased, and that was where all the middle-class people lived. So the middle-class people so much believed, as it were, in the uniformitarianism, that the unpredictable doesn't happen, that the unpredictable is not a part of nature. So, very soon after seeing this and being completely stunned by it, I thought this was perhaps some sort of anomaly. But then I was flying into JFK, one day, and I looked out of my window at this area that's called Long Beach, and the Far Rockaways. And they're absolutely built on a barrier island. These massive buildings, residential buildings, they directly face the sea. So that a storm surge or a wave coming towards them would have a fetch of thousands of miles. And I looked at them and I thought, they're just sitting ducks. If a great hurricane or a tsunami should strike, they're just going to be obliterated.
And some of the richest people, that's the point you make, that they are...
not in the Far Rockaways.
Rockaways, okay.
Elsewhere, yes. Yeah. But so this entire area was devastated when Hurricane Sandy hit,
Sure.
And again, if you look at that pattern of settlement, it's not accidental. Again, you completely see the role of governmentality in planning and creating these settlements. Sure. So that's when I began to think about this, how did people relate to the sea? And that's when I began to look at pre-modern cities. And pre-modern cities are all actually, not on the sea. It's only in the colonial period. And even there's a very interesting dichotomy. Pre-modern colonists, pre-Enlightenment colonists, like the Portuguese, did not build on the sea. They were far more careful. When they took control of the area around Bombay, they actually built their first settlement on a headland, which was actually at an elevation, and it was a place called Bassein or Vasai, which was actually not an island, because Bombay today is 6 islands joined together by various kinds of fillings in and so on and so forth. And a lot of it is actually reclaimed land, And that land, we think of it as being reclaimed, but who's going to reclaim it? Bombay, New York, and the remarkable thing is both Bombay and New York come into the possession of the British Empire at almost exactly the same time, which is in the 1660s. The Dutch exchanged Manhattan for a tiny island in Indonesia, an island called Run, which I just visited. It's in the Moluccas, it's really at the other end of the universe, but they made this exchange. They exchanged Manhattan for this island Run. And similarly, the Bombay came to the British through Catherine of Braganza. It was a part of a dowry, which also included the first chest of tea to arrive in Britain, with leading in a long series of consequences to the Opium War eventually. But so what did the English decide to do when they got Bombay? They didn't want to build where the Portuguese had built. They decided to build on island Bombay. Why? Because islands were easily defensible. Islands were easily reached by maritime routes. So they built Bombay there. And Bombay today is a catastrophe waiting to happen. And I've detailed this in my book.
Yes.
Because one of the strange effects of climate change is that cyclonic activity is actually accelerating in the Arabian Sea. And Bombay has already had several narrow misses. And if Bombay were to be hit by a superstorm like Sandy, it's just incalculable what would happen, because Bombay is wedged between two major nuclear installations. Bombay is 20 million people. How do you actually evacuate 20 million people? Bombay is connected to the mainland through basically two roads and one rail line. You know, it's a promontory like this. I mean, it's all filled in, so it's become like a peninsula, but it's connected to the mainland through only two major roads. And these roads are jam-packed
Yes.
even at ordinary times. So in the event of, suppose a cyclone is approaching, you have maybe 5 days warning. Within 5 days, you can't get those people out. And we also know that even with warning systems in place, people don't leave.
Sure.
You know, there's a sort of, how shall we say, there's an inertia of motion. People don't leave. And, you know, strangely, the people who leave, who cling most tenaciously to their homes are middle-class people. Why? Because middle-class people are not mobile. Because their real estate is almost most of their wealth. You know, it's most of their well-being. They just simply cannot afford to leave. They feel scared. You know, they feel scared of giving up their apartment or whatever and going away. So, you know, heaven forfend, but if something like this should come towards Bombay, I don't know what would happen. But, you know, one of the good things about this, about the publication of this book is that since it was published, actually all sorts of collaborations have started on creating evacuation mechanisms and so on. But, you know, what I've said about Bombay is true also, mutatis mutandis, for Chennai, another 1660s city. It's true also for Kolkata. In Chennai, you know, Chennai is Madras. So when this book was released in India, I was actually in Madras, and someone gave me the perfect example of derangement. Last year, Madras was hit by this new sort of climate phenomenon, which I think we had here these last 2 days, which is a rain bomb, you know, which is a stalled weather system which just dumps enormous amounts of precipitation on in a short period of time. But what happened in Chennai was really epic. I mean, you know, the whole place was completely drowned. Shortly after the city sort of recovered, a developer announced that he was going to build this giant sort of mega luxurious condominium very close to the sea and also very close to the river that had flooded. And this mega condominium would have a 7-story basement for parking cars. And people snapped it up. So, you know, just like any day, you look at the real estate listings for Miami.
Yeah.
You know, and I mean, these are rich, informed people who buy those houses. You know, which are, as we watch, they're going under.
Sure.
You know?
Yeah. No, thanks very much, Amitav. Amitav, if I can move to the final part of the book, where you know, when one talks of the problem of politics and climate change, there are some givens, you know, about the complicity of politicians with fossil fuel industry. There are lots of things we hear about why there is a lack of political will. But one of the things that I really got out of reading your section is you really got to the heart of, I know you don't like the word moral, but what you got to the heart of was the problem of conceiving, the paradox and price of conceiving the politics in terms of human subjectivity only, and your individual and human collective moral endeavors, but not in terms of the non-human forces of climate, which are seen to exist at a scale where often it's hard to formulate policy, cost-benefit analysis doesn't work when there is so much uncertainty. And you have a very telling sentence to illustrate that, which I just want to share with you. You say, consider, for example, the stories that congeal around questions like, where were you when the Berlin Wall fell? Or where were you on 9/11? will it ever be possible to ask in the same vein, where were you at 400 parts per million? This is the carbon kind of measure, right? That in the last how many years it's grown from 280 to 400 parts per million. Or where were you when the Larsen B ice shelf broke up? So it's just the inability of human experience and politicians kind of, so what we're seeing here basically is the meshing of different kinds of scale, of say human biographical scale, the species scale, biological thinking species, but also the geological scale, which many climate historians have talked about. And when you have these non-human forces, the calculus of justice and liberty become really, complicated. And you do, in really very evocative ways, you do address that issue. So can one conceive of justice across these scales? And I'm not saying you should give us any answers at this stage, but these are the kinds of questions that are raised in the politics section of your book, and its limits. Its limits. That's why there are limits to thinking politically in relation to climate change, because of some of these larger issues.
The question of justice, perhaps we can come back to, but certainly this question of subjectivity and politics. Certainly, I mean, it's perfectly clear now that, our political system, I do think that the society of the spectacle is, for me, a really key text to understanding what...
That's Guy Debord's,
Yeah, Guy Debord's book. And it's easily available on the internet, so you can download it and read it. It's really remarkable how prescient this book was, written in the 1960s, and how completely he predicted what we are in. That we are in the society of the spectacle controls us. We no longer have control of the spectacle. And really, in various ways, to participate in politics even in the most limited sense today is to join, as it were, the society of the spectacle. So, this society, this spectacle really actually enjoins us to think of the political as the subjective. This is my experience. I mean, you look at the ways in which political life today, or in which political ideas are expressed today, they're so often in terms of testimony. And I think this comes very much, actually, in the end, from a certain kind of Protestant tradition, which valorizes testimony, which valorizes, bearing witness, and so on. So we live in this world, in a world of politics, where the words seem to be those of very close to some kind of religious experience, where we talk about morality, we talk about ethics endlessly. And, it's always posed in terms of morals in this way. Now, I think the introduction of morality into this whole climate debate is a very dangerous thing, actually, because, many people who are concerned about climate constantly talk about making this a moral issue. The problem really is that there is no one morality. I mean, we know that, say, for example, if you consider the dominant sort of mode of ethical thinking, of ethics, really, within the United States, it derives from John Rawls. And for Rawls, there could be no intergenerational justice, and there was no what he called cosmopolitan justice. That is, no justice between nations. Justice was only possible within a nation. So, automatically you see that, these ethical standards are not applicable, to an issue like this. It just shows how hollow, really, these forms of ethical thinking are. But again, so much of contemporary Western ethical thinking ultimately derives from thinkers like Locke and Hume and so on. And for whom, as I said, who was it who said, "Why should I care more for another person's well-being than I do for the nicking of my thumb?"
Yeah, David Hume. Yeah.
David Hume.
Yeah.
So within a calculus of, say, individual costs and benefits, this kind of collective predicament can really have no place, you know. So it's in that sense that I think when climate activists try to frame this in terms of morality, they're really creating a conundrum for themselves, because you'll notice one of the ways in which climate deniers invariably will attack climate activists is by saying, I mean, anytime any climate activist says something, the automatic question is, what have you given up?
Given up, yes.
Look at you, you came here in a car. Look at you, you came here in a plane, you know? So it becomes a question of how many light bulbs Al Gore uses,
Yeah,
you know? Which ultimately reduces the whole issue to complete triviality. But you know, this is not the only mode of politics. I mean, there is another, I don't know if we would consider China a political system, but it is a fact that China is preparing, very rapidly for this changing climate world. And if you ask any major climate scientist or climate thinker, they'll tell you that the country that is most likely to weather climate change successfully is China.
Yes.
Naomi Oreskes says so, James Hansen says so, because they are planning. You know, and I was in China. People in China don't talk about climate change very much, and they were actually very surprised to know that I had written this book. But they all know, and they know, moreover, that steps are being taken.
Sure. So one final question and comment before we open it to all of you here. So I understand the conundrum of the moral that you just outlined, just the sheer impossibility and absurdity of it in the terms you put it. But very interestingly, your book ends by comparing two documents that came out in 2015. One is the Paris Climate Agreement, and the other is the encyclical a letter of the Pope called Laudato Si. And it's as a textual scholar, literary scholar, it was fascinating to see your comparison, where you say that actually the language of disaster and catastrophe appears way more in the Pope's letter than the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement seems like so bureaucratic, so sober, and the comparison between the two. But you also seem to suggest in the book that really if there is any force that one can look to, if religion can be of any good in any way, because the scale of the problem is so large and so sublime, that religion here can be a force. You can almost immediately see a certain skepticism from many quarters, because one also sees the dangers of religion today, right? Religion is such a polarizing force at the same time in today's world. So I just would invite you to just say some thoughts about this kind of religion as a force as a contributor to the debate on climate change.
Look, I'm not religious myself, and if I thought it possible that popular movements around the world could effect this change, I would certainly make that argument. But you know, the problem with the whole climate issue is the time threshold. You know, the time threshold is so short that's really the problem. It takes decades to build popular movements. And moreover, you know, one of the really eerie and scary things that we've seen is that governments today have created, and this is true across the world, they've created these incredibly efficient surveillance systems for tracking all kinds of popular protests. They're able to follow these protests very, very carefully. In Paris, just before the Paris agreements, they were able to put 40 major environmental activists under house arrest. You know, immediately after these terror attacks. How did they know who these? Because obviously they're keeping track, and the same is happening here. You know, many of the law enforcement agencies have identified what they call eco-terrorism as a major phenomenon. So environmental activists in America are certainly under surveillance. And I don't know if any of you have come across a book called Green is the New Red, It's actually kind of really interesting to read. I mean, it's actually by an environmental activist who was locked up for a long time. So, under those circumstances, in fact, state authorities now have a much greater repressive power than they did in the past. So I find it very hard to believe that any kind of major popular movement can arise. We've seen how effectively, countries across the world were able to suppress, for example, the anti-globalization movements in the 1990s. So they're thinking, and they they know how to deal with this. So again, for me, so is religion a way around this? I don't know, but I certainly think that Pope Francis's Laudato Si is the single most important document to be produced on climate change. And most of all, I think it is so because it completely departs from the forms of rationality that are at the heart of the Paris Agreement, which are exactly the forms of rationality of governmentality, of business and entrepreneurism, that gave us this problem. If you look at the language of the Paris Agreement, it's exactly the language of global trade agreements. It uses exactly the same vocabulary. Yeah. The rhetoric of it is exactly the same. Equally remarkable, the Paris Agreement completely shuts the door on climate reparations. It only once uses the word justice, and there it's in quotes.
Quotes, yes.
Some think that climate justice is important. Can you imagine? I mean, so it's a complete, what can you say? It's just an absolute whitewash of all the major issues that we face. And what is so extraordinary about the Pope's document is really that justice, poverty are absolutely at the heart of the document. Yes. It's at the heart of the document not only in its concerns, but in its language, yes. In its rhetoric. It's written in such a simple style, yet it's deeply informed by climate science and by extremely advanced thinking of many different kinds. Yet it's a document of extreme simplicity, and you can see that what he's actually trying to do is to reach into the homes of the humble. Those people who are actually the constituency of the Catholic Church. So yes, I think that, I don't think that religion as such is going to be a force to help in this, because let's face it, most of the religious systems in the world today actually have taken as their model a certain Weberian Protestantism, yes. Just accumulate more, buy more, consumerism on every scale. This is essentially the Islam of Erdogan, it's the Hinduism of Modi, it's the Buddhism that is now prevalent in Thailand. So what can you say? I mean, if you look at those alternative traditions, it's very hard to see any signs of anything that is encouraging. But I do think that the Pope's document is an extraordinary document. And let's not forget, he reaches 1.2 billion people.
Yes. All right. Thank you so much. Amitav, please join me in thanking Amitav.
Thank you.
And the floor is now open, and let's have a conversation. This is meant to be a seminar, so yes. Could you just wait for the microphone to come to you, please? Thank you.
Could you please comment on the role of changing nuclear power expectations, particularly after the disaster in Japan, and how it might play a role in giving us more energy over time, because it put a big damper on the expectations that we would be able to use nuclear power more effectively after the disaster in Japan. I would love to hear your thoughts on other sources of energy, because I don't see the need for energy or demand for energy decreasing.
I'm not an expert on that kind of thing, and I can't really address those issues with any kind of authority. There are many, many people who can, and James Hansen, for one, believes very much in that nuclear power could be an alternative. But, last week I was at Princeton and talking to some of the nuclear experts there, and they all say that, basically what James Hansen and others are talking about is, what is it called? A certain kind of, a new generation fission-based nuclear reactor. And the technology apparently doesn't exist. And actually to build reactors of that kind would be enormously expensive. So even in terms of economics, it wouldn't really work. I think when we talk about these alternative energies, one of the real problems with this whole question of energy was actually identified by one of the earliest energy economists, Samuel Jevons, in the 19th century, which is the Jevons paradox, that greater efficiencies of energy actually lead to more consumption rather than less. So I think that is really where, if suddenly we have, it's, as you must also know of this dilemma called the paperless office paradox. People thought that, once you had once you had the internet, offices would become paperless, instead of which they started using much more paper. So I don't think that energy efficiency or alternative energy as such is going to solve this problem. Why? Also because, it's not as if creating solar panels is innocent of impacts on the environment. You need all sorts of rare earths. You need also all kinds of technological apparatuses in order to create these panels. Similarly, if you take a wind, these giant windmills actually have to be mounted on enormous concrete towers. So, and concrete is after fossil fuels the most environmentally destructive substance that we have. So, I think really we need to talk about how do we cut back, And really, if you just think about it, in this room, why do we need so many lights? What's the point of it? Where a few lights would do.
Yeah, they did put it off, and I told them to put it on because it got too dark. There was all light on us and no light.
But then don't you think that is also the issue, that what is our relationship to light? Yeah. And this question constantly comes to me when I fly across America. You look out of the plane and there's these vast tracts of empty space which are all lit up. Most of all, you see these parking lots all sort of like blazing into the sky. Why? Because they're afraid of crime. So ultimately, it's not just an environmental impact. It's also, it's these human relations and the fear and the violence, really. Ultimately, it's the threat of violence which powers our consumption on this scale.
Margaret? Yes.
Dialogue and a most impactful book. Returning to the end of your conversation, I was struck by your comment that Pope Francis had a former profession as a teacher of literature. I hadn't known that, and I think for many of us who teach literature, a really important tenet for us has been that literature is a site where we can imagine alternative possibilities. And your work, I think, is a very powerful indictment of a failure, really, to imagine otherwise in the contemporary literary imagination. But I wondered, might we find refuge still in other places? And I'm particularly thinking of the poetic or maybe music, and whether those are the forms where that sort of imagining alternative possibilities for the future might come.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly, in an aesthetic sense, that's absolutely true. See, I think one of the reasons why the Pope is able to frame climate change in this radically different way, what is so startling about this document is that it uses many of the same materials as COP21, but rhetorically and in every other way, it's a completely different framing of the issue. And why is this possible? It's possible because he can draw upon a faith tradition that far predates modernity. So in fact, I think what is new in this document is actually old. he's able to summon, the teachings that go back, Similarly, I do think, for me, certainly it's become absolutely clear that we have to look more and more seriously at pre-modern forms of thinking, pre-modern forms of expression, pre-modern forms of poetry, pre-modern documents of all kinds. And the more I look, the more I find.
So there was a question here. Yeah. Oh, did you have your hand
Yes.
up? Oh, okay. So there's a queue. I'll put your name down and then you can,
Hi, thank you so much for your time. Just a quick question. I wanted to know what is your insight or opinion about the degrowth movement that was proposed by the Club de Rome in 1972. Just a little bit about that.
I am all for degrowth. I completely, I think it's a great idea. I completely support it. But, I'm from India, and I travel a lot in Asia. I can tell you that anyone who goes to India, goes to any part of Asia, can see that degrowth is very, very far from people's minds. In fact, Asia is today in this frenzy of growth, So we have our Prime Minister, who signed this COP21, and he occasionally makes welcoming noises about climate change action and so on. But if you go to any airport in India, you'll see that there are these big sort of billboards outside saying Prime Minister Modi has opened 251 solar-powered airports or something like that. So on the one hand, you have this sort of obsession with solar power. At the same time, you're opening more and more airports. So these are the aspects of the derangement. That we are thinking in these completely circular ways. Ways which actually make no sense at all.
Christian?
I was very glad to hear about your optimism in relation to China as the country that you thought was more likely than any other to meet the challenges of climate change. It certainly matches my own sense of what they're doing when I've been there. But I'd like to hear a bit more from you as to why you have this optimism. And I'd also like to link it a bit to the question about religion as a possible mobilizing force. Because in the Chinese case, what would that be? You talk a bit about going back to earlier pre-modern forms of thinking, maybe also more traditional religions like Christianity. But China calls itself a communist state, and still, at least defers to a kind of Marxist ideology. So what is it that the Chinese have, do you think, that might act as a kind of mobilizing force in relation to there? And, is that the basis of the optimism, or is it something else?
Let me say that the optimism is not really, properly speaking, mine. I'm actually reporting to you what, say, Naomi Oreskes, James Hansen, etc. say. And what James Hansen says is that his reason for being optimistic, and I think optimistic is the wrong word. Obviously, China too will be badly hit. But his reasons for suggesting that China is moving on this issue very quickly is that it's run by technocrats. The country is run by technocrats. They understand the issue. They understand how you can respond to the issue. Secondly, their framing of the subject is not in terms of morality or goodness or being kind to the earth. Their framing of the issue is in terms of survival. And that is the ultimate pre-modern form of politics. Politics is and always has been about taking decisions that allow the body politic to survive. It's that simple.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for the talk. I found it really interesting, and it's great to have a sort of a voice accompanying your book to think through a lot of what you were talking about. And when I was reading your book, one of the things that I found most kind of compelling is the idea that in some ways climate change is a sort of return of the repressed. And I think you bring that out really well with the story that you relate in the beginning about sort of looking into the eye of this totally anomalous tornado. But I also I think we've been hearing a lot from you about the idea of a sort of transformative, not politics exactly, as almost a transformative anti-politics. And I was interested to see that in the book you elliptically kind of refer to Eduardo Cohn's work on this sort of idea of iconicity and how it structures human thought. And you alluded to mimesis a couple of times here as well. But it seems to me that the mimetic kind of faculty is both sort of redeeming and the problem completely. Like the imitation of technology has been kind of at the center of driving global capitalism. So I was wondering if you could just talk about, maybe also in your fiction writing, how you've thought about this kind of global spread of some sort of structure of desire and this kind of more intimate sort of politics of the individual in relation to structures of desire.
Sure. Look, in the end, what this is all about is desire, and particularly mimetic desire. That's what we see. I mean, really when, say for example, I was recently in Ternate, which is where cloves originally came from. And one of the extraordinary things that's happening in Ternate is that because of climate change, clove trees are dying, And I spoke to many people there, and I said, do you think, considering the circumstance that you're in, that you should make cuts to your own emissions in order to slow down climate change? And you can go and ask this question to a person in Bombay or in Delhi or in China or wherever. What will their answer be? Their answer will always be that, why should I make cuts? The West created this problem. They polluted the atmosphere so that they could have a higher standard of living. Now it's our turn, so that we can be like them. So the statement is completely mimetic. We are locked into this cycle of mimetic violence. We should have no doubt about what this is. This is a war. This is a war under another name. And I simply cannot see how you can break this cycle of mimetic violence, certainly not through any kind of governmentality. And there again, is one of the reasons why I find Laudato Si so interesting, because again, it's a non-mimetic framing, And again, we have Gandhi's non-mimetic framing, where he says so clearly that, if 300 million Indians were to consume in imitation of the West, we would devour the world like locusts. So, if you just think about that, what an extraordinary statement that is. Because what he's actually doing is that he's renouncing, on behalf of 300 million people, the right to wealth as conceived elsewhere. Today, nobody could make such a statement. They simply could not, because if they did, they would be considered, absurd, and they would be considered reprehensible in a sort of Uncle Tom way. Because we now accept, everywhere in the world, we now have a single standard of wealth and well-being, and we all accept it. And this canon of wealth and well-being is completely mimetic.
So you talk a lot in the book about the sort of deadlock in the public sphere, and how there's been this loss in personal agency, actions that you can actually take that will make a difference. So I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit, and talk about what an individual can actually do that could potentially make a difference, if there's anything.
When I'm asked that question, I often say that I think the most effective thing an individual can do is to support Pope Francis. Because, frankly, I can't see that there's any form of leadership anywhere in the world which is addressing these issues, at the core issues, because what we've been locked into is this technological, bureaucratic framing of climate change, whereas it's a problem of culture, it's a problem of desire, it's a problem of mimesis, and when we talk about these other things, we're just rearranging deck chairs, The core of this problem is not in the end, even technology, the core of the problem is power. It's the distribution of power. I think we are really skirting these issues in so many ways when we think about them in terms of individual agency and so on. Let me just give you one example of that. The single biggest consumer of fossil fuels in the world and in the US is the Pentagon. The Pentagon uses more fossil fuels in its Middle Eastern operations alone than the entire nation of Bangladesh, which is 180 million people. The Pentagon alone consumes more fossil fuels than 2/3 of the world's countries. What individual action are you going to take that will have any bearing on the Pentagon? I mean, that doesn't even figure. And I mentioned the Pentagon, but the same is true of Russia, the same is true of India, the same is true of China, Saudi Arabia. All these countries are growing their military establishments at a frantic rate. So, we located in universities try to think of this issue in feel-good ways. But you can be sure that the people who are actually in power understand and see this whole issue as an issue primarily of violence.
Okay, yeah, Michael?
I have a question, especially thinking about violence. I wonder if you could reflect a little, trying to think optimistically, what are the possibilities for a Gandhian approach being useful here? I was thinking, in fact, the quotation you said from Pope Francis about, what if 300 million Indians were exploiting the world in the same way? Gandhi, in fact, said the same thing almost maybe 100 years ago now, and actually was mocked in his day precisely for this position of saying, look, we don't need to be mimetic with respect to the British Empire. We don't need the goods that they're offering. Those are imagined goods, and we need to rediscover what real goods are. So do you think, especially thinking of the struggle in terms of violence, is there any possibility for a popular movement? Or I know you have reservations about the scope of that, but we've seen, at least in Gandhi's case, that there was a real possibility of bringing together huge numbers of people, right, in the name of some common cause, and the tremendous possibility for action that historically might have seemed impossible, except for the fact that we know historically it was possible.
Well, Gandhi won one battle, which was the battle for independence. But the battle that was more important for him really was to create a different mode of economy, a different mode of life. And that struggle he completely lost. I mean, in India itself, nobody today gives a fig for Gandhi's thoughts on these subjects. India is just completely locked into this pattern of mimetic desire. Is it possible that the Gandhian movement could arise? Of course, it's possible. But again, as I said, to create a mass movement around the world would take 20, 30 years, and we just don't have that time.
So the March on Climate that's happening on Saturday, where I'm sure many of our youth are going to participate, Amitav, and the various resistance movements that have begun in this country. So it's just a certain way of, what do we tell the youth? What do we tell? It's an intergenerational issue. We know that. And they are looking for ways to act. They are not, So what is it that we as educators, as writers, as parents, I would say, yes, go and protest, go and participate, resist, in at least make a little bit of a difference, if it does make a difference. The politics here around climate change is deranged, cutting funding from NASA's climate program, the implosion of EPA, and even if they kind of choose these local or national issues, there is some kind of a force. What are the grounds for action if we tell them that there are no grounds? This is something that I really battle with as well when our students raise these issues in class?
I certainly think that you should go and protest, and you should make your voice heard. And ultimately, the point of that is, maybe it'll make some difference in the world, but it'll also reaffirm your own sense of self. So let's not be in too much doubt about it. I mean, a large part of it is about feeling better about ourselves. In terms of the derangement of the present-day politics, I don't think it's as deranged as you think. I mean, people think that, Trump and the people around him are deniers or that they don't know about climate change.
No,
That's not the case at all.
Yeah.
Stephen Bannon actually was one of the funders of this biodome project in Arizona. He's extremely well informed about climate change. It's not that they don't have a plan. They have a plan. And the plan is precisely this. I mean, that they've come to the conclusion that the only way a Western lifestyle is sustainable is if millions of people die. That's it. That's their conclusion. So, we hear a lot of feel-good talk around this issue, but you should know, I look at the things that climate scientists say about climate deniers, and it's interesting how they have a certain theory of language in the public space. They think that language in the public space is as transparent as, say, language in the laboratory. But we all know that language in the public space is mainly about concealment. So no politician in the world today can get up and say, well, if millions of people have to die in order for me to live my lifestyle, so be it. They can't say it, can they? But they can think it, and you can be sure. I mean, a couple of days ago, I was in Washington. A guy came to I was talking about these things. A guy came to the talk, and he said, you are not talking about all those people in India and Africa who bred and created so many people, so many children, and population, and so on and so forth. And, invasive, they're like invasive species and so on.
Asians and Africans. Yeah.
But, that's again a curious thing that they think, in this way of thinking, they think that it's the poor of the world who will pay the price. And actually, they're wrong. That's the really startling thing. They are deluding themselves as much as anybody else. Because, yes, maybe many poor people will die. But, the people who are most vulnerable, actually, are the affluent. Or not even necessarily the affluent, but people who are tied into the bourgeois world. I'll just give you one statistic,
The affluent will go to Mars, right? Or the 1%.
I'll just give you one statistic, There was a terrible heat wave that you may remember from the Persian Gulf region 2 years ago, where actually the experienced temperature was something like 75 degrees centigrade, including humidity. But actual temperatures were in the upper 40s. And the death toll was actually only, so far as we know, a few thousand. Similarly, last year there was a terrible heat wave in India, and again, the death toll was not that great. I mean, again, you could say statistics are not reliable. But I don't think it was more than a few hundred or something. In 2005, there was a terrible heat wave in Europe where, temperatures didn't come anywhere close to this. 70,000 people died. In Russia, there was a heat wave. Something like 50,000 people died. Why? Many of these people were old people who had no communities, who were alone. They had no one checking on them. So, it's a complete fallacy to think that only the poor are going to pay the price. In fact, you can make a case to say that the country that has to date suffered the most from climate change is actually the United States. You think about the wildfires, you think about these epic droughts, you think about Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Katrina, sea level rise along the coasts. I think, so they are actually deluding themselves. In fact, I think in many ways, poor people who've always had to deal with the land They are the truly climate resilient, you know.
All right. Any other responses? Okay. Amitav, thank you so much
Thank you.
for giving so generously of your time. And please join us for a reception. There's some hors d'oeuvres out there, and continue your conversation with Amitav Ghosh. Thank you.